Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to say a little bit about the situation in Europe. This is called an International Identitarian Congress. And so far, the reason I'm talking in a way is to try to tie this Congress together with a very important movement, identitarian movement, that's taking place in Europe. This is the first identitarian Congress I know of in North America. But the movement has already taken root and has already spread rather widely in Europe. And I want to try to tie together what is happening here today, the consciousness, the awareness that people have here in this meeting, with the rising awareness that's taking place in Europe as well. First of all, before I start that, I want to once again express appreciation for this Congress, this meeting, and also to make one point I think that's very important. In our work, whether it's in North America or Europe or here in Mexico, we aim, or we should aim, above all, I think, to direct our efforts at reaching those who can, and I believe must be, leaders in the future if we are to have a future. That is, above all, at younger people, younger men and women. And that's why I'm gratified that over the course of this weekend, there have been so many younger men and women who I have met and who are here and who have heard what the speakers have had to say this weekend. As everyone knows, one of the most remarkable developments of recent years in Europe has been the rise of anti-establishment political parties. In May of last year, dissident parties in Europe scored impressive victories in the European Union parliamentary elections. Commenting on the surprising results, a New York Times columnist wrote, and I'm quoting, "The European Union is still reeling from the insurgency of this past week's elections to its 751-member parliament. But after a political earthquake, as the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls called it on Sunday, it is worth sifting through the rubble of hyperbole in search of resilient continuities. In Denmark, the far-right Danish People's Party topped the poll and doubled its number of members in the European Parliament. In France, Marine Le Pen's National Front also achieved the best results. Across the Channel, the United Kingdom Independence Party, known as UKIP, did the same thing, beating all the major parties. In Hungary, the dissident Jobbik Party is now the country's second largest political formation. Reviewing the results of the May 2014 election, a BBC News commentator wrote, "It is hard to overstate the momentousness of what has just happened in France. A party that just 2 or 3 years ago was regarded as not just contemptible, but untouchable, has won a national election. Today, the Front National really is, as the posters rushed out at party headquarters put it, the biggest force in the land. Up until Marine Le Pen's takeover in 2011, the party was effectively under an establishment banning order. Today, unbelievably, it has the largest number of French members of the European Parliament, and in a legislative body that is an integral part of the European system of government. The Front National, the National Front, the historic pariah, is stronger than both the Gaullists and the Socialists." Last month, the results of local elections across France reconfirmed the National Front's continuing vitality and appeal. Just a few weeks ago, commenting on the steady erosion of support for Europe's traditional parties, a BBC News analyst wrote, again I'm quoting, "Why is this happening? The obvious answer is that it is partly the result of years of economic crisis, particularly in Southern Europe. For many voters, mainstream parties have failed to step up to the challenge. But there's also a more general malaise, a feeling that ordinary lives are being buffeted by forces and institutions beyond the control of voters. Traditional parties across Europe are under pressure as never before in recent memory." Another expression of this, very specifically, is the movement called the identitarian movement across Europe. It takes different forms in different countries. But as I said, it has taken root in France, where there are websites, organizations, even a television station that gives support to the identitarian movement. Also in Germany and Austria, in Italy and other countries as well, this identitarian movement has grown. Perhaps one of the most stunning manifestations of the dissatisfaction in Europe that has taken place, and especially in Germany, is the rise of the so-called Pegida movement, which was talked about yesterday. It was unthinkable that 5 or 10 or even 2 years ago, that thousands and thousands of Germans would gather together to express their rejection of the trends that are taking place in Europe, and specifically the large-scale Muslim migration that is taking place in Germany and, of course, the rest of Europe as well. This Pegida movement has garnered tens of thousands of people in demonstrations, above all in the city of Dresden. All of this, as mentioned earlier, is an expression of great dissatisfaction across Europe. One person who has commented on the bleak social economic situation is the Pope, Pope Francis. And he was moved not long ago to make a scathing attack on the system that prevails in the United States and Europe. He warned that the system is near collapse because of what he called a throwaway culture of greed and the atrocity of youth unemployment. The Roman Catholic leader sharply criticized what he called the idolatrous economy for disregarding the young, which he added has led to shocking levels of youth unemployment and risks producing what he calls a lost generation. The rise of these dissident political parties also underscores another important thing: the intellectual bankruptcy of Europe's establishment parties. The thinkers, the writers, and ideologues of the political parties that have governed since the end of the Second World War, whether they regard themselves as conservative or moderate or middle class, or whether they regard themselves as leftist or progressive, lack any persuasive or inspiring vision for a better future. All they say now is more of the same, and this is not resonating with the public. In fact, the public increasingly is dissatisfied with this. All this is an expression of much more than anxiety about the lackluster economic situation. It reflects a broad and growing unhappiness with the general direction of social, cultural, and economic life. Across Europe, as well as in the US, people sense that something is very wrong. Public opinion surveys on both sides of the Atlantic show high and unprecedented levels of distrust in politicians and in major institutions, in short, distrust of the system. Large-scale immigration, especially from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, is driving and accelerating third worldization, dramatically transforming the European continent's cultural, racial, and ethnic character. Across Europe, the birth rate is well below the replacement level. Europeans, in short, are dying out. Europe, as well as the United States, are in the grip of an ever more obvious social and cultural dissolution. Mainstream politicians in the US as well as in Europe are utterly unable to offer any convincing way out of the malaise or any credible prospect for a better future. In these trends, America is, as it were, setting the pace. With each passing year, the United States is ever more obviously and rapidly becoming an unrecognizable third world kind of country. During my lifetime, many cities and entire regions of the United States have been transformed demographically, with the replacement of an overwhelmingly European origin population with a non-European one. Over the past half century, Southern California, where I live and work, has been transformed more radically, more fundamentally than Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries changed during 45 years of Soviet Russian occupation and control. The outcome of the Second World War meant, for the first time in history, that Europe was entirely under the control of outer European states, or at any rate of regimes on the periphery of the West, namely the United States of America and the Soviet Union. More importantly, the outcome of the Second World War meant the imposition on Europe of an egalitarian ideology, a Soviet Marxist version in Eastern and Central Europe, and a more seductive, individualistic American version in Western Europe. In the years since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the American egalitarian individualist outlook, including US-style mass democracy and consumerism, is now the governing ideology across the continent. According to this outlook, the ideal society is not a nation united by ethnic, racial, cultural, or religious bonds, but rather a collection of individuals of maximum diversity, bound together only by a legalistic social contract or a supposedly shared embrace of what are called democratic values. The highest social political goal, according to this ideology, is not a healthy or enduring nation, but rather a multicultural society devoted to material prosperity, individual rights, and to what the U.S. Declaration of Independence calls the pursuit of happiness. In the United States, this outlook was, from the beginning, considered so magnificent and transformational that the country's founders regarded the USA as a radically new kind of society, a nation that would be a model for the world. That's why the Great Seal of the United States, which is on the back of every US $1 note, proclaims that 1776 is not merely the year of the country's birth, but marks the founding of what it calls in Latin, a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. In keeping with this view of American society and its form of government as superior to all others, politicians of both major US political parties proclaim with almost religious fervor their belief in something called American exceptionalism. And you'll hear this not only from those who call themselves conservative. Even President Obama, in an address at West Point Military Academy, said, "I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being." This ideology not only means that the U.S. regards itself as the morally superior leader and grand architect in forging a new order in the world, but implies that there is a purposeful trajectory to history, a definite direction in human development, and that Americans are the providentially ordained pioneers in shaping the entire world in accord with this ideology. Over the past century, American presidents have repeatedly affirmed this confident but also arrogant and utopian view about the direction of history and America's role in it. In 1917, when the United States entered the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson solemnly declared that he was sending young Americans across the ocean to kill and die as part of a grand undertaking to end all war and to make the entire world, as he put it, safe for democracy. During the Second World War, President Franklin Roosevelt made similar pledges, likewise in keeping with this purposeful view of history and America's central ideology. The United States, Roosevelt stressed, is the great world leader in shaping a new global order in which aggression will be eliminated permanently. And beyond that, he pledged, a new age in which even fear and want will be banished everywhere in the world. It is this same messianic outlook that moved George W. Bush to refer to his so-called war on terrorism as a crusade, and in a major speech to proclaim a U.S. foreign policy dedicated, as he put it, to ending tyranny in the world. In this great U.S.-led undertaking, he announced, neutrality is not an option. He said, either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Faithful to America's ideology, President Obama proclaims that an important feature of U.S. foreign policy is to push for what he calls gay rights everywhere around the world. Because the United States is still very powerful and influential, it has the ability to promote and often to impose, with sometimes astonishing arrogance, its egalitarian, individualist ideology. Prominent Americans take pride in the notion that the U.S. is, or should be, the great leader in making an ever more diverse and multicultural world. This view has been voiced, for example, by U.S. General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, with overall command of NATO military forces on the continent. In the modern Europe, Clark said in June 1999, there is no room for homogeneous national states. It was an idea from the 1800s, and we are going to carry it, that is, multiculturalism, through, and we are going to create multi-ethnic states. What General Clark, along with other American leaders, mean is that France must not be French, Sweden must not be Swedish, Poland must not be Polish, and so on. Now, although it is outside the main focus of this talk, I cannot help but take a moment to note that there is, of course, one striking exception to this grand American policy, an exception that reflects the interests and the agenda of those who wield decisive power in the United States. American politicians insist that one country, Israel, must be recognized and maintained even at the cost of American lives as a specifically Jewish ethnic religious state. In keeping with this ideology, the United States works to break down cultural, racial, and religious identity and cohesion everywhere in the world, prodding, cajoling, persuading, and pushing every country to be like the United States of America, a collection of individuals, a cultural and racial melting pot. Thus, the Americanization of Europe means the cultural, biological death of Europe. In spite of its relative economic prosperity, Europe today is in greater danger than ever before in its history, far worse than the consequences of military defeat, a terrible war, or a devastating plague. Europe today is threatened with cultural, ethnic, and racial extinction. That is, the destruction of the very foundation of everything that is European in any real or lasting sense. On both sides of the Atlantic, political, cultural, and intellectual leaders relentlessly promote an egalitarian universalist ideology, a delusional outlook, divorced from reality, that refuses to acknowledge the most elementary truths of society, of heredity, and of history. In accord with this ideology, political leaders in Europe, as well as in the United States, push policies that break down and are meant to break down the traditional cultural and ethnic character of Western nations. The current malaise of the West is the entirely predictable result of policies based on premises about life and society of the prevailing egalitarian individualist ideology. In the months and years to come, events will continue to unfold in keeping with the futile effort to make reality conform to an impossible governing ideology. That is, the trends of the present will accelerate, which means inevitably more crime, racial strife, and overall social, cultural disintegration. Just as the former Soviet Union eventually fell apart as the inevitable consequence of trying to organize society on the basis of an ideology and principles unrooted in historical, social, and biological reality, so also this society will and must continue to decline as it tries to force nature and reality to conform to wishful thinking based on an unsound worldview. A nation that embraces an ideology that is not rooted in reality, that is, an ideology of denial, falsehood, and wishful thinking, cannot endure. It will not survive, and it does not deserve to survive. Given the gloomy trends of our age, it is entirely understandable that many people, even men and women of goodwill, despair and turn inward, seeking solace and refuge in a self-contained or narrowly focused life. Personally, I find it helpful to remind myself that by keeping expectations low, one can avoid or at least minimize disappointment. During the final years of the Second World War, the leaders in Germany and the other Axis countries repeatedly warned that defeat would be a mortal calamity for all of Europe. In 1943, the great French writer Louis Ferdinand Céline wrote that the German and other Axis forces were the last great bulwark of the West. Accordingly, he said, the fall of Stalingrad was the end of Europe. If the stern warnings of the German leaders in 1943, 1944, and 1945 were valid, and if Céline's grim assessment was correct, then no one should be surprised by the social, racial, and cultural disintegration of our age, and correspondingly, our expectations today should be very low indeed. While I regard the outcome of the Second World War as a calamity for Europe and the Occident, I hope, of course, that Céline and the others who shared his view were wrong in their belief that the outcome was a mortal or fatal blow. In any case, it's not a matter that should overly concern us. We are living today in an age, one that the religions of the East have called a Kali Yuga, an age of perverted values, one that rewards those who deceive and punishes those who tell the truth. You may recall the tale of the emperor's new clothes, in which a small boy in a silent crowd is the only one to say out loud what the grown-ups think, but are too conditioned or intimidated to say, "Look, the emperor has no clothes." And with those few honest words, the boy exposes and deflates a pretentious fraud. We must be like that honest young lad in the tale, because the frauds that prevail today, while no less pretentious, are far more dangerous. In an age of universal deceit, George Orwell once said, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Today, more than ever, it is vitally important to defy the imposed conformity of our age and forthrightly affirm basic truths. What is needed today are not simplistic slogans or wishful thinking about a utopian rainbow future or foolish efforts to save some remnants of a vanishing age, but candor, honesty, and defiant determination. Instead of merely complaining about what's wrong or asking what someone ought to do, each of us should rather ask himself, what can I do? We should, each of us, strive to do our duty as our mind and our heart tells us, obeying the commands we give ourselves. At the same time, we must not permit intimidation, malicious smears, or threats to keep us affirming what is true and doing what is right, strengthened by the confidence that future generations will respect us and history will vindicate us. Our duty is to hold fast, to not despair, and to persevere in this long twilight struggle before the dawn of a new and better age. Thank you.